Hey guys. Okay, so we're on page 21 of Edmund Morgan's article, and we're talking about the labor force in Virginia in the 1600s. And he said that the population had begun increasing in Virginia in the 1640s, which in turn limited opportunities for upward mobility. And the sort of elite ruling class of Virginia thought this was pretty dangerous. It's dangerous. It's dangerous because of the nature of the workforce. They were young, they were single, and they were predominantly male. So not super stable. And then Morgan tells us on page 21, finally, what made these wild young men particularly dangerous was that they were armed. They had guns and they had to be armed, right? Because they're in Virginia in the 1600s, and there was constant threat of attack from Indians because, of course, the English were taking the land of Native Americans. So attack from Indians by land and from privateers and petty thieving pirates by sea. So, of course, people needed guns. So this labor force was dangerous because they were young, they were single, they were men, and they were armed. If you're a rich guy in Virginia in the 1600s, you see this workforce of people who have all of these characteristics, that would be a little scary to you, is what Edmund Morgan is saying. Okay, so he's talking about this dangerous workforce. And in fact, he says the rich guys, the elites, like the governor, whose name was Berkeley, they were afraid and their fears were justified. And then he uses Bacon's rebellion to say, yes, their fears were justified. There was this big rebellion of essentially poor people that started as an attack on Native Americans and turned into an attack on the government and on the rich people of Virginia. So you can read about Bacon's rebellion in tons of places, including our two books. So I want you to make sure you understand Bacon's rebellion. But I'm going to move on, as Morgan does, to his argument that Bacon's rebellion was a shattering experience for Virginia's first families, for the rich people. It was very scary for them. We don't want a bunch of young, single, armed men wandering around, is what they said to themselves, because they do things like get discontented and burn down the Capitol. So, okay. So, how the elites began to react was to deal with the problem exactly as England had done before, restricting liberties. Restricting the liberties of those who did not have land, the badge of freedom. So he documents how this happened for servants. It became harder and harder for indentured servants to gain their freedom. However, even despite all these efforts, the ranks of poor, free people began to grow. So, what to do about this problem from the perspective of your rich Virginians? Morgan says there was another solution. A solution which strengthened the rights of Englishmen and nourished their attachment to liberty. And he says what that solution was to rely on an African labor force. To no longer give Africans the same rights that Englishmen had. And in fact, he's saying the rights of Englishmen were preserved by destroying the rights of Africans. So I'm reading this article, right, and I see, oh, we're getting toward the end. this is where we were on page 24. So I think, we're actually getting to the conclusion. And the reason I say that is because he's starting again to kind of tell you about his argument, and I'm going to go back to my previous slide now, returning to this theme of the central paradox of American history, answering this question, how this occurred. And he's saying here, the rights of Englishmen were preserved by destroying the rights of Africans. He's saying, I'm not arguing that Virginians deliberately did this. In fact, slavery came to Virginia as an unthinking decision. It wasn't even a decision, it was automatic. And he explains why right here. But basically, slaves were more expensive than indentured servants. However, when a planter, a rich tobacco planter, say, bought a slave, he was buying a lifetime of labor. Whereas when he bought an indentured servant, he was buying 5 to 7 years of labor. Now, back in the days when everybody was dying in Virginia, it didn't make sense to spend a lot of money because that lifetime of labor might only be 3 or 4 years. It made more sense to buy the cheaper indentured servant. However, after the 1640s, as life expectancies increased, it began to make more sense to spend more money and buy a slave. So that's what he's saying here. And he's saying, well, he has this sort of counterfactual paragraph. What if that hadn't have happened? But who can know? He talks about the laws of Barbados, another English colony. Begin to give evidence in terms of how slave codes developed, how laws about slavery developed. So by the late 1600s in Virginia, it seemed convenient and reasonable to have different laws for black and white. And particularly as the number of slaves increased, it also began to make more sense to have laws about this. So, okay, we're getting to the conclusion, as I said. And his conclusion is really about slavery. So we go back up to this really important couple sentences on page 24. The rights of Englishmen were preserved by destroying the rights of Africans. I'm just gonna type that right here. The next couple paragraphs, as I just mentioned to you, were about the institutionalization of slavery, slave codes, laws about slavery, correlating slavery with race, with Africanness, and taking away rights of African Americans. So there's this poor group of people, right? From the perspective of the rich Virginian guys, there's a bunch of poor people who are discontented because you're making them work really hard and they don't have freedom. The choice is that poor group of people going to be indentured servants who eventually will gain their freedom and then become young single men who are armed? Or are they going to be people who have no possibility of ever becoming free, or certainly never of becoming armed? It was very much against the law to give slaves guns or let them near guns. Moreover, in an enslaved labor force, women could be required to make tobacco just as the men did. So women could be imported too, and they would do the same kind of work that men did. Versus for the English, English didn't think that English women should be farming in the fields. Enslaved women also made children who in turn would become slaves, right? Or were slaves, in turn would be an asset to the owner, and that they would be providing their work labor too. So, hold on. Okay, so I just typed a labor force who would never be free, right? That's what the institutionalization of slavery did. It provided a labor force who would never be free. And the other thing that Morgan talks about here is that actually this is the thing that enabled Virginians to think about liberty and rights for all, because they're not including the poorest people in their consideration. In the 18th century, because they were no longer threatened by a dangerous free laboring class, Virginians could afford these ideas of republicanism, taxation, rights, representation, whereas in Berkeley's time, they could not. It was slavery more than any other factor that made the difference. Slavery that enabled Virginia to nourish representative government in a plantation society. Slavery that made Virginians dare to speak a political language that magnified the rights of freemen, and slavery, therefore, that brought Virginians into the same Commonwealth political tradition with New Englanders. The very institution that would later divide North and South may have made possible their union in a Republican government. So Morgan's argument, therefore, is that slavery and freedom are not a paradox, but actually slavery in colonial Virginia, in many ways, is what facilitated freedom. So I want you all to think about that as you are answering your study questions. What is Morgan's argument? I just gave you one version of it. I want to see it in your own words. And as you write your reflection papers, again, all of our authors use Morgan. I want you to think about when Morgan wrote this article, what was going on in 1972. I want you to think about when Howard Zinn wrote his book, and when the authors of Patriot's History of the U.S. wrote their books. And I want you to think about how both of these authors use Morgan's work, and how they use it similarly and how they use it differently. Okay, thanks guys.